Hi folks, this is Alan. If you listen and like these podcasts, please consider making a small donation to keep these podcasts alive. Unfortunately, at the moment, I have no other means of generating an income, and I do really enjoy making these recordings for you. If you are like me, struggling to make ends meet, and you can't afford to make a small donation, then please simply press like and subscribe and recommend this podcast to a friend. That would be a tremendous help. And thanks for taking the time to listen. I really do appreciate it. And I will put the link in the description below. Thank you. This week's travel story is about my journey along the great Amazon River, traversing the 5,300 kilometers across South America in 5 different boats. Each boat being different, not just in size, but also in the facilities, or the lack of them, as well as the ratio between the passengers and the supplies aboard. For example, on one large vessel in particular, we carried hundreds of people on several different decks, all sleeping in hammocks, but carried almost no supplies to the villages or towns along the way. And that was an exception, as most of them hauled the much-needed supplies downriver to the indigenous communities who needed it, whether it was for the tiny settlements with the huts made of palm fronds or the larger tin shack towns. And the supplies ranged from sacks of onions and potatoes to crates of live chickens and ducks, to water tanks and small generators, to new motorbikes and even big trucks. And this adventure was just another in my journeys that I hadn't planned, because some of the best places I've ever been to were well-known places, but I just didn't know they existed before I went there, if that makes sense. As I've never done a lot of research or planning when I travel, as other travellers seem to do, because it definitely takes the adventure out of the journey. And with an unplanned trip, I never know what to expect or what will happen along the way. And I'll give you an example of that. Many years ago, I was on a 7-hour train journey heading down to the Cambodian border from Bangkok. And I remember it well, simply because of the hard, uncomfortable seats. In those days, all the Thai trains had nothing but wooden bench seats. Back then, they were so uncomfortable that I took some t-shirts out of my backpack, folded them up and sat on them. And sitting on the other side of the carriage were a young German couple, backpacking their way around Southeast Asia. And they asked me if I was going to go to Angkor Wat. Well, I'd never heard of it. This was well before the internet and mobile phones. And back in those days, we found out about different places by talking to other travellers, either on the road or in the hostels and guest houses we stayed at. Other than that, we only had guidebooks such as The Lonely Planet or On a Shoestring. And before then, it was all word of mouth. And after they told me about Angkor Wat, I decided to stop in Siem Reap, as my original destination was Phnom Penh, the capital, to check out what the Khmer Rouge did back in the 70s. Now that was horrendous and spine-chilling. I hadn't planned this excursion to Angkor Wat, which made it even more exciting. I had no idea really what to expect. And what was even more unforgettable about that journey was the high-speed taxi ride from the border town to Siem Reap city. With the Germans in the back and me in the front alongside the driver, we set off. It was only about 160 kilometres, so just imagine back then when that road was unsurfaced, no tarmac. It was just a loose dirt road, and a dirt road barely wide enough for 2 vehicles in some places. The driver had his foot to the floor, driving flat out, overtaking and undertaking everything on either side of the road, whichever he decided was the best side at that moment. And it seemed that everyone in Cambodia drove in the centre of the road, regardless of what was coming the other way. It was like playing chicken all the time, as they only moved over at the very last second. The highlight of that taxi ride for me was when we drove between 2 massive tipper trucks coming straight towards us, and they were side by side dicing on the dirt road as one was trying to overtake the other coming straight towards us, and filled the road. We raced through the middle, between them, with only centimetres to spare. And just as we'd cleared the trucks, I turned around to see the look on the faces of the German couple sitting in the back. But they weren't there. They were down on the floor, hiding behind the seats. But personally, I've never been a nervous passenger. For me, it was an epic drive. In fact, it was one of the best taxi rides I've ever had the pleasure of experiencing. And the whole thing was unplanned. I was going to go by bus. And my Amazon River experience was more or less the same. So let me tell you how I came to be on the river. In fact, it had never occurred to me to use the river at all. That wasn't planned either. Which turned out to be almost 5,300 kilometres from one side of South America to the other in boats. That experience only came about because I got a message from an old friend in Sao Paulo, Brazil, who said he'd just lost his job and thought it'd be a great idea to meet up with me now that we were on the same continent at last. Well, at that time I was in Cusco in Peru, so we made a plan to meet up in Lima, my next destination. But when I got to Lima, he'd been offered some freelance work and said he'd meet me in Belém. In Belém, which was on the north-east of Brazil, it's in the mouth of the Amazon River, where it flows into the North Atlantic Ocean. In Lima, I stayed in a great backpacker hostel, called the 1900 Hostel, because that was the year it became a guest house where people could stay when visiting the capital. And a friend of a friend showed me around the city, and he told me about some of the real dodgy things in the seedier parts of town, and some even in the upmarket ones too, because allegedly around the narrow back streets behind the courts and the Justice Department buildings, you can get absolutely anything forged perfectly if you have the money. Then after a few days, I caught a night bus to Pucallpa. Why Pucallpa and not Iquitos? Well, that's simple, because that's as far as the road goes. That's where the road ends. It just doesn't go any further. But this bus journey turned into a long and arduous trip, because we had to dodge massive landslides caused by very heavy rains at that time. And there were many times where the traffic was backed up because nobody could get through. So bad and so unpredictable were the landslides that we were forced to stop on many occasions until the bulldozer came and cleared the road. So what should have been a comfortable 17-hour bus ride ended up being a very tiring 25 hours by the end. But when you're an overlander like me, you take it in your stride, because it is what it is. And these are the sort of exciting things that don't happen to you when you're 33,000 feet up in a plane. Pucallpa is a really busy and industrious trading town, right on a bend in the river, with a good atmosphere and friendly natives. It had a great vibe. The next day I took a tuk-tuk down to the port, a very busy, smelly and mosquito-infested place. and I made a few tentative inquiries and found out which days and when the boats set off to Iquitos on the Amazon River. And a couple of days later I headed back down again and found my boat. The boss of the boat was an old wizened Arab-looking man with a dark tanned leathery face and a short white beard, and he wore a dark blue robe edged in gold trim, and he took my money easily and folded it into a thick wad of notes, then put it back in his pocket under his robe. The facilities were super basic aboard that first boat. I bought a cheap string-type hammock in the market the day before, and it cost me 10 soles, because I'd bartered the shop owner down from 15, and that's about 2 or 3 euros. Now that's what I call value for money. This first boat was all hammocks, and getting on board early helps when finding a good spot to string it up. And once my hammock was up, I then stowed my backpack on it, well before the majority of passengers arrived to fight over the best places. Then I went outside and watched as they loaded supplies on board for the Amazon villages and towns along our route. And then the passengers descended on the boat, arriving in droves by tuk-tuk. And by the time we finally left the dock, the boat was roughly 50% indigenous people and 40% supplies, and that included 3 trucks and several small motorbikes, and lots of large round fiberglass water tanks. And there wasn't even enough spare space aboard for another hammock or sack of potatoes. Amongst the passengers was a Japanese film crew making a documentary, a young Dutch couple backpacking around South America, and a really strange-looking Indian guy who'd painted himself dark blue all over, and he had a guy following him around with a camera too. And myself. We were the only foreigners aboard. All the other passengers were locals, and our journey would take 4 nights and 5 days. If you're a sensitive and delicate kind of person, it's possible that this type of river travel isn't for you, because we were packed in like sardines in a can, where the people's habits and basic behaviours, along with the basic sanitary conditions, could easily be overwhelming, even for the hardiest of foreign travellers. And the toilets, showers and sinks used the brown, muddy river water, where I'm assuming the toilets were flushed into. And with our hammocks squashed together side by side until there was no more space, yeah, this particular type of boat trip wouldn't be for you. When we docked at a village or a small town on the river, I quickly went ashore and grabbed something to eat, or to buy whatever food I could find and get back on board. Luckily, further downriver, on the other boats, where the settlements were bigger, food sellers were ready to board the boat or sell us pre-made food from the quay. And some boats had kitchens, and we got meals twice a day that were included in the ticket price. Out of the 5 boats, this first one was the most basic. So life actually got better and easier as we travelled downriver. I spent a lot of time on the top deck looking to see what wildlife was along the river banks or in the trees on the edge of the jungle. I saw plenty of monkeys and eagles and even a couple of capybara, but that's about all. And I was constantly searching the wide river for the elusive pink dolphins, which I did see, but much further downriver. Every evening throughout that whole trip was just awesome, with great sunsets and an orchestra of calls and howls from the jungle as the light faded. And I learnt a lot on that first boat on the river, from Pucallpa to Iquitos. I spent some time ashore because my next boat was only running once a week at that time and wasn't leaving for another 4 days. I'd found some relatively cheap accommodation on the other side of town and spent my days exploring the historic riverside city. I also went down to the port, some kilometres away from my guest house, in an old rattling tuk-tuk. And this port, like the last one, was also very busy, seriously smelly, and mosquito infested. And being in the seedier lower part of town, it was ankle deep in smelly, slimy mud. And at that time, the whole city was struggling to control a virulent outbreak of dengue fever. So I'd be much happier when I get out of this town and back on the river. And that was the first leg of my journey across the top of South America. So tune in next week as I continue to recount my journey along the great Amazon River.
Well, that's all for this week, folks. And please remember, the same road can be travelled 1,000 different ways, so get out there and make it your own. Until next week.